Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Offsite channel for podcast number 4. We have Lucas from Modulize joining us today to discuss AI in the construction industry, offsite construction industry to be specific. So I look forward to what Lucas is going to show us today, and hope you do as well. Lucas, if you could give us a quick introduction about yourself, and then we can find out more eagerly. Thank you.
Sounds great. Really good to be here. So yeah, my name's Lucas, originally from Germany. I've spent a number of years in various domains, always working with something related to data, AI, machine learning. So spent some time in London, working in academia, got my PhD at Imperial College, and then kind of moved my way through academia, not-for-profits, larger corporates, and ultimately ended up in the startup world where I am today, where we're building Modulize, and we're trying to build some, I think, pretty relevant solutions for the offsite construction industry, which we'll obviously get into later. But that's just a few words on me.
Yeah, you're based out of Oslo in Norway, right?
That's right.
Nice,
yeah, so
nice city to be based out in, definitely. So
yeah, that's right. I've been here for a couple of years now and enjoying myself up north.
Good. So, yeah, quite keen to hear more about the AI and how it will affect the offsite industry. Definitely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
We're excited to see what you have for us today. It's our feeling that some of what you're going to talk about today is the future.
We do hope so. Yeah, definitely. So maybe we obviously have set as a topic that about talking about empowering offsite construction with AI and machine learning. But Greg, like you already said in the beginning, this is all in the context of construction as a whole, right? And I wanted to, before we really dive into that, kind of take a step back and talk a little bit about really what I think are pretty endless opportunities, but then we'll get to the point where maybe it's not all just rosy and great, but just to set the scene a little bit, we have all of these kind of different areas in which we see some pretty major potential in terms of using data-driven solutions. And often, obviously, when we talk about data-driven solutions, that means artificial intelligence, machine learning, and we obviously won't get into all of the details of that, but that's broadly the bucket, right? We want to do intelligent things with the data that we have, that we collect. And that cuts across things like computer vision. So we use live imagery or moving imagery to extract information such as safety hazards on construction sites, right? That's a pretty current topic that people are looking into. Natural language processing, right? So taking an unstructured document and extracting information from it. You have building documentation. There's a startup up here in Oslo that's working on that called Findable, right? And what they build is a sophisticated algorithm to take these hundreds of thousands of documents to extract the most relevant information from that, because that's something that we do manually today in a lot of cases.
Yeah. So would that be like the building code, for example? Could that be like,
for example,
what dry lining specification, timber sections?
Yeah.
Interesting. That's really good. Yeah.
So it's really all of the above, and in a lot of cases, it's even a step further, just the sorting of the documents, right? Say you have multiple thousands of documents for larger building projects, and they all sit in various places. Where do you even start in terms of putting its structure on that? So it's all these things that you can start doing when you apply these types of solutions. And that obviously the list continues, so we can like pick up a few more examples. But really, I think the bigger point here is that if not everything, pretty significant parts of what we do today in a building project can, and I guess we can say should, in some shape or form be touched by these types of solutions, because it's a huge industry. We have all of this data and collecting more and more of it, right? I have here Internet of Things. So you talk about smart buildings. The raw amount of data that we collect when we equip buildings with sensors is often pretty insane, right? So you have to layer on top of that some intelligent solutions to make sense of that data, because otherwise you throw in some sensors and then what, right? So there's often, I think, a lot of opportunity, but then I guess that also gets to the next point, or I guess the next question is really, are we ready for that, right? So I think in a lot of cases, we it's almost kind of easy to see the potential in some cases as you start digging and you see, okay, there's all of this data, but then the practice often looks a little bit different, right? And there I just wanted to like dive into a few issues that I've seen kind of still being relatively new to this industry. So I've previously worked in a job that was finance related and research, so academic research in not-for-profits, like I said. So I've kind of seen these types of solutions being deployed in various environments, and in some it's easier, in others it's more challenging. And while we see these types of challenges that I'm listing here, so like the closed ecosystems, which I can talk a little bit more, or like not necessarily having like a culture around making good use of data, and then other points as well. You see that in various other industries, but some of them are, I would say, particularly pronounced in construction, which can make it pretty challenging to even get started with these things. And then maybe so picking off the closed ecosystems, right? So that I think is a really interesting one that I was actually a little bit surprised by coming out of different industries in some of the workings in construction, where you have some open standards around data, you have some closed standards around data, right? Proprietary formats, but then everybody's working potentially on the same project with different tool stacks, right? They might use this CAD tool, that CAD tool, and then they try to work with each other. And every time you import or export, say, an IFC file in and out of that application, you go from proprietary standards to open standards back and forth, and the results can be pretty bad, right? And can be very difficult to work with that and have consistent data.
When we had one of our first podcasts, Christopher, we spoke about IFC files, BIM, and with Franco, and we mentioned that the architect will have their own BIM model, but the building system hasn't been procured yet. So then the manufacturer has to have their own building model, and those two don't typically match directly because the architect's drawn it, the manufacturer's drawn it. Now the MEP guy is going to draw it, and then the HVAC guys are going to, so everyone has their different models rather than single IFC.
No, totally, and we see that with our manufacturers as well, right? They even in some cases, even during the bidding stages that we care about with our first product at the moment, right? They will receive a building model, and in some cases, even for the bidding stages, when they don't know if they're going to win the project, they have to spend the time, in some cases, redrawing the model, which obviously creates major bottlenecks, right? If you have to do all of that work, not for the projects that you win, but for every project that comes into the door, that can be a major time and cost sink. And that a lot of that relates back to actually multiple of these points, right? If you, from beginning to finish, had like a really ingrained culture around being data driven, which isn't always the case, or often the case in construction as far as we can see. And obviously, that being said, that's as true for tons of other industries, right? So there's very few industries that have actually solved this. But it's these kinds of things. And then the overall adoption of technology sometimes can be spotty. So maybe in some cases you have the data, in other cases you don't. Maybe you go across countries, right? And there's different practices, and you have all of this friction that just kind of compounds over time, and it can get very difficult to, what I guess is the last point here, right? To have consistency and repeatability. And I think that's also, in my mind, really the jumping off point to kind of pull this all to and put it in relation with offsite construction, because there I think there's some really cool and exciting synergies that, and I guess that's maybe what we'll spend a bit of time on for the remainder, is to kind of bring that together, is these data-driven approaches and good uses of offsite construction building projects in a lot of ways both depend on and facilitate the same kinds of things, because it's all about consistency, repeatability, being able to plan in some way, one way or another, either rely on or enforce certain standards, right? That all of these things are super important to get the most out of your data and be able to deploy machine learning and AI-based solutions. and super important to get the most out of using offsite construction in a building project.
Yeah, the uncontrolled environments. Christopher would be able to tell us about that, because obviously in the country like the United States, you will use different building codes, different states will have do things different ways. So I can imagine in the US, Christopher, that would be trying to standardize across the states would be quite a difficult task.
Yeah, that's going to present a challenge, certainly not insurmountable, but there are so many jurisdictional differences and building codes and, different types of snow and other things that we have to focus on. I think with the data-driven model, everyone has a concern for intellectual property, and how far that goes. And I think the biggest hurdle is really just going to be saying, okay, this is what we're going to do. We have to try this. I mean, this is the future, right? It should not take 18 months to build an apartment building, right? And we can get that done in a matter of weeks if we use the technology, but somebody's got to be willing to take that chance and say, hey, this is the future. I'm buying into this. Let's form a partnership. Building the system of allies.
No, definitely.
Sorry.
No, I think you like picked up on what I think is a really important point, because you can kind of see it playing out in some other industries in a different way. Is this kind of willingness to like give up some ground, say in terms of maintaining control and practicing some level of openness, right? Both in terms of open standards, but data sharing and accessibility, kind of having the right kinds of touch points between different systems so that it's a smooth process, right? Where you take the finance sector, at least in Europe, with like open banking standards, like APIs being built in a way that you can pull data from different places that maybe used to be very closed off and proprietary, right? And that unlocks a whole new set of solutions, and startups maybe building off of that and coming up with creative ways of making the industry better, right? Some of that depends on exactly what you're saying, right? Taking that first step and having some, I guess, trust in sharing and practicing openness, actually ultimately producing a good outcome and not being too afraid of that.
Yeah. It's definitely a forward way of thinking. So hopefully it can go that way, and it would be to the benefit of everyone, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So maybe what I can jump into a little bit is, I guess this point, right, that we've kind of been leading to, is that when we talk about standardization and what that means in the case of now going a step further from construction to offsite construction, right, there is today two areas of standardization where we see problems, right? Maybe there's more, but those are kind of the two core ones that I want to highlight. Is one, it's in how we build, right? So very few things are built in a way where, say, the process or the efficiency or the lowered carbon footprint are celebrated in the same way as building something that is unique and striking is celebrated, right? So there's the standardization and all the benefits that it could potentially come with can be challenging to realize, right, for various reasons. So that's one issue, right? Some things preventing us in a way from celebrating the potential benefits, and then as an effect of that, moving more towards standardized and repeatable approaches, right? And obviously there will always be a need for very tailor-made solutions, but maybe it shouldn't be at scale, right? If we talk building multiple thousands of housing units, maybe that's not the place to avoid standardization at all costs.
Yeah.
And then secondly, the same is true for data, right? There's low degrees of standardization. So we really talk about two different types of standardization that I would argue are missing at the moment in a lot of cases, that are preventing us from, one, getting the most out of offsite construction, and two, getting the most out of the data that we might use to facilitate that process.
Yeah. So building the technology, what have you found to be the most difficult aspect of that?
Yeah. So what what I think is really, really cool is that it is definitely not the most difficult aspect to get people excited about this stuff and see a potential future of these kinds of approaches being used in a better way. So I've not at all felt like, and that I don't know if that should be surprising or not, but I don't feel like there's actually reluctance to this. I think it's just like, okay, we don't really know how to really make this work at scale. So I think that's been a really, really positive experience, like being still pretty new to the experience. What I do think is a massive challenge, and that's, I can kind of maybe use a very particular example that goes back to the underlying data, both its availability and its kind of structure or lack of structure. So for example, us trying to build a solution that is based on IFC and using IFC files when they're still at a relatively low level of detail, which is often the case during a bidding phase, right? So that's the kind of stage of the process that we've built our first tool for. The files are just very, very inconsistent, very difficult to deal with, which means that we can build a solution that works for a lot of files and you get the intended results, but at a way too high frequency, you get a file that has some weird artifact in it, whether it's the quality, the level of detail, some kind of classes being used in the wrong way, and the system breaks, right? And when standards and common practices aren't enforced and used to a certain degree, then it becomes impossible to catch all of the edge cases, right? So you can never build a solution that will actually work because you depend on the input having a certain quality, right? So it's this, in machine learning, we like to talk about garbage in, garbage out, right? So you can build the fanciest solution, but if there's a quality issue with the input, your application will break. And we've seen that in practice multiple times. And that is a major challenge to kind of even get something off the ground.
Yeah, I've had the pleasure of speaking to your colleagues before, and I've had the pleasure of meeting them. And we discussed previously that typically you're provided at pricing stage, certainly with PDFs rather than IFC. And it's mentioned that was something you'd know when, So it's probably still the case, especially in light residential standard buildings. IFCs are still very scarce, and PDF would be the normal. Then once you win the job, you would typically get the DWGs or the AutoCAD files. So IFC is still a bit away for a standard house, I would say.
Definitely.
Well, bidding projects is part of the cost of doing business. You know, the garbage in, garbage out. I mean, software is one thing, but having the designer to be able to put the information in properly is another thing. Are you running into any challenges with finding that type of collaboration? Are you having that kind of challenge?
I guess for me, so obviously, our initial focus has been building a tool for offsite manufacturers. In the meantime, though, we've been having a lot of conversations with, say, architects and designers, for example, because we do over time, and we will cover maybe that a little bit at the end, but over time want to build more of an all-encompassing solution that helps higher adoption of offsite construction. I think in a lot of cases, it's somewhere between difficult and impossible, I think, to ensure, even if we want to have this right level of quality, high level of quality without spending too much effort, right? Because especially at the early stages, maybe you don't want to or are able to spend all of these resources to come up with a perfect model. And again, that does come back to the data, right? So if we go into one level more detail with IFC, right? You have these so Building Smarts who maintain IFC as a standard. They've been developing these data dictionaries, right? That you try to layer on top of IFC to kind of enforce a common structure. If that gets broadly adopted, that might solve some of these issues, right? But at the moment, IFC is almost too flexible in some cases. So it can be very difficult to even know what you should be putting in. So I think it's not, I haven't felt like there's a lack of intent. I think we as an industry are still just have some way to go in figuring this out. And at the moment, we're still at that stage where, like, to I guess some of the previous question, are we ready for it? I think in some cases we're still some ways away from that.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's just what we see day to day. It's still very PDF driven, and then 2D AutoCAD files.
Yeah, definitely. No, we've seen that as well. And so especially at the bidding stages, the majority of files that we see are still PDF. And PDF is much easier to deal with than IFC from the data perspective, right? Because it is much more restricted, which in this case can be an advantage.
Yeah. All right, cool.
Nice. So maybe just as like to the point of trying to like bring this all together, like I said previously, what I think is actually one of the more exciting kind of angles in this space, trying to think about these two topics, right? Artificial intelligence and offsite construction, relates to the previous point where I think they really both depend on and facilitate standardization, right? And you can use different terms for standardization. We can talk about repeatability, we can talk about consistency, integrity, all these different terms. But what it basically, I think, comes down to is offsite construction. If you want to get the full benefit, you probably want some degree of standardization and repeatability, right? That's what we, at least in the right types of projects, want to move to, right? We don't want to create a multifamily unit with timber frame walls where we, in the factory, produce 45 different wall elements, right? We lose so much of the potential in that process. So that depends on a increasing degree of standardization. And then you need to find the right balance, right? And the same is true for AI and machine learning, where you need to be able to rely on the data, and it needs to be consistent, and you can't have all of these differences. Like the most basic issues pop up, right? If you have 5 different databases and every single one of them uses a slightly different format to capture a date, right? US format, European format, that's already a problem, right? So you need some consistency and standardization in the data. So what I think is really fascinating is that if we talk about driving offsite construction forward, and a pretty important part of that being a high level of standardization and repeatability, I think that actually then creates the perfect breeding ground or the perfect match for more data-driven approaches. Right? And then the question becomes like, what comes first? It's like a chicken and egg problem almost. But I think it's just a really, really cool marriage in a way where both of them really thrive and depend on very similar ways of doing things. So I think what that kind of at least can entail, if we think about it in that way, is that of all of the construction industry as a whole, I think offsite construction might be the place where we can really prove the value of using these kinds of approaches, because we're inherently driven towards more consistency anyway, because otherwise we won't derive the full value from building in this way. Right? So I think that's where it's really, really cool to see these as something that I think could, at least in at some point, really, really go hand in hand and show the way both in how we build better, but also how we are more quantitative and data driven in how we do things.
Yeah, no, it is interesting to see, or a glimpse, what people like yourself and in the software business are doing. I guess one of the actual, Christopher, you'll probably remember AI. There used to be a feature in a trust software called AutoFrame. I don't know if you ever used that before. It was okay to fill it out, but you still needed the person there behind it driving. Do you know what I mean? It would help you out, but you would never take it as being the. But that obviously, going from that software 15 years ago to what they have now, is the improvement has come. You still have to be a designer, but the software helps you conduct your work. But it's always difficult. I still think you need the person there to oversee, and because it'll never be perfect. But
no.
can get.
Yeah, and there's a specific term for that when we're in the machine learning and AI world, right? And it's called human in the loop. So it's basically building solutions in a way that don't like abstract away and replace the person, but just build processes that take both and produce something that's better, right? Because exactly to your point, for so many of these use cases, maybe you need close to perfection for whatever the workflow is. And that maybe is not something that you can achieve with just trying to automate it away now, if ever. So then there's a lot of ways of addressing that by building these human in the loop type solutions, right? That maybe get you 70% there, and then you kind of adjust the results and the output by the human in the loop part. And so building these synergistic solutions is also a really, really exciting field, which I think could have and already has some pretty massive use cases in the construction industry as well.
And that goes right back to what we're talking about with data-driven information. I mean, the auto frame that Greg mentioned works great if you spend the time to set it up right.
Yeah.
But if you don't, then it's a waste of time. So tell us a little bit about Modulize and what you guys do and how your vision is carrying into the future.
Yeah, definitely. So basically, as I kind of hinted at a little bit, we've been initially building a tool for offsite manufacturers to help them streamline and automate the bidding process, basically. So the part of their workflow where they receive a tender request and they need to come up with a price quote, right? So pretty specifically inserting ourselves with a software as a service, cloud-based tool that helps make that process easier, because it's a massive bottleneck for these types of manufacturers. So I don't know the numbers for all of them, but we go like anecdotal evidence. One of our customers spends around 20% of their entire headcount on estimating. So it's that kind of initial niche that we're targeting. But what we really want to do is build a solution that over time makes offsite construction a much more obvious and easier choice in a lot more building projects, and do that in our case in a software only way. So this tool that we've built is really the first stepping stone in building a platform where we build this network of manufacturers, and then we help figure out the right ways of building for a given project, so that we can connect the manufacturers to their customers, generally the general contractors, on a marketplace/platform type play, where you can then, because we have more and more manufacturers using a software that we produce, we can also figure out more data-driven approaches to look at a project and figure out which parts of this project should be done offsite. So that's what we're moving towards. And then in the longer term, the idea is really to end up using that data that we're collecting to also feed it into the into the design and concepting phase, because that's obviously where a lot of the decisions get made that influence whether or not offsite construction is the right choice. So the end goal for us is to build an end-to-end platform that connects all of the relevant stakeholders and gives everyone the relevant data to make the best decision, which we think will much more often lead to choosing offsite construction. And then in some cases, maybe it's still not the right choice. And that's also fine, right? It's not to say that everything needs to be done offsite, but there's this distribution that we want to help find for every building project, which we think includes a lot more offsite construction than is the case today. And we want to build that underlying infrastructure to help make that happen in a more data-driven way.
Perfect. Well, I want to thank you for coming on, Lucas. It's been a great insight into how tech companies build their software, and specifically for the offsite construction industry and the considerations that you take, and a glimpse into the future, Christopher.
Thank you so much, Lucas. Great potential. I mean, I see.
I think so.
Lot. Yeah. So I'm excited to see where this leads moving into the future.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think this is a super exciting field to be in, and there's just so much potential in what we can do. Thanks a lot for having me, guys.